Hello, everyone. Welcome to another fabulous episode of The Thoughtful Bro, live streaming to you as usual on Tuesdays at 2 on A Mighty Blaze. Today's guest is sort of who I want to be when I grow up. The great literary podcaster, probably, I want to say, among the foremost literary podcasters in the world. It is such a treat to have Brad Listi on the show today. We're going to get to him in a moment. He's also, by the way, an author who has written a searing, concise book full of crystalline prose about the kind of confusion and horror and glory of being a writer and trying to make your life as a writer. We're going to get to all that in a second, but a few words before we get started. As you know, A Thoughtful Bro is here every Tuesday, or most Tuesdays, here definitely for the next 5 weeks on Tuesdays. We have some great guests lined up, but we broadcast on A Mighty Blaze, which, if you don't know, is a volunteer initiative that started at the beginning of COVID to try to help writers reach readers virtually, online. Now that COVID has gone, thank God, we are still going strong. At A Mighty Blaze, we're never asking for your money. If you want to show the love and show the support, just please like us, like the hell out of us, retweet us, tell your friends about us, post it on your stories, just show the love on social media. That's how you tell us that you like our shows. And if you do want to spend money, though, I have an idea for you. You can spend it on books that explore how to be a good artist, a good husband, a good father, a good human being in this crazy, chaotic world of ours. Books like Be Brief and Tell Them Everything by Brad Listi, which, by the way, has one of my favorite all-time book titles, Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. We're going to spend a whole part of the interview just talking about what that title means and how he thought of it. I think it's, frankly, if I created a list of like epithets of like my 10 favorite pieces of writing advice ever, that the title of Brad's book would be on that list. We'll put links to buy his book in the chat through bookshop.org. Please go ahead, open a new browser tab and buy a book right now. Let me give you a little info about Brad and who he is. If you don't know, Brad was born in Milwaukee. His books include the novel Attention Deficit Disorder, which was an LA Times bestseller, and Bored, B-O-A-R-D, a work of nonfiction collage co-authored with Justin Benton. He is the founding editor of The Nervous Breakdown, an online literary magazine, and in 2011, of course, he launched the Otherppl podcast, which features in-depth interviews with today's leading writers. It is now, I think, on its 850th episode. This is episode 99 for me, so I look on in awe, having done about 1/10 of what Brad has done. His novel, Be Brief and Tell Them Everything, is a darkly funny work of autofiction, a meditation on creativity, family, and what it means to be both a good man and a good artist. It's gotten comps to Knausgard and Sheila Heti. Author Sam Lipsyte called it an elegant distillation of family, heartbreak, financial precarity, spiritual uncertainty, the terror of contemporary life, and a quest for meaning. Brad Listi, welcome to The Thoughtful Bro.
Well, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
You know, the dulcet sounds of Brad Listi. I was saying to you in the green room, it just, the sound of your voice, I don't know how you do it. If your microphone, it's just your voice. I don't know what it is, Brad, but
well, I want to let your audience know that if I look haggard, if I look sad, it's because I went to Disneyland yesterday in 95-degree heat. So I am spiritually broken. And last night too, after we got home at like midnight, I'm like giving my screaming child a bath at like midnight. And then I finally get into bed and fall asleep almost immediately. And then our smoke alarm at like 3 a.m, you know how when the battery starts to weaken,
yes,
the smoke alarm will issue
every 10 seconds or 30 seconds. Yes.
So that happened on top of it, just to add insult to injury. So I just want to offer this disclaimer as we get started in case people are looking at me and wondering if I'm okay. I'm fine, but I'm recovering from my Disney experience.
Well, you were like semi-live tweeting your Disney spiritual like breakdown, but you also said on Twitter that you had a spiritual breakthrough. And could you share with our audience what that spiritual breakthrough was?
I think it's a Disneyland is hell, especially in heat. I'll say this about Disneyland. Like I get it. It's great for kids. It's a magical experience for them. I don't want to deny my children that experience. I think that's where most parents, even parents who are critical of Disney, sort of come to. But they let entirely too many people into the park, or they need to make the park bigger. It is an absurd crowd to deal with. Yeah. And then to have it be 95 degrees just adds a layer of inhumanity to the whole thing. So I don't get it. They need to like cap the number of people they allow in. You can barely even move in the park.
Oh my God.
Yeah, just horrid.
Oh my God. Well, I'm glad you made it here today. Thank you for being here, Brad. I know you're a busy guy, and we're going to talk on the show today in the next 45 minutes about your life as a writer. We're going to talk about your book. We're going to talk about your life as a podcaster. But I do want to start by saying that you have started doing this thing with your show where you record your show in video format like this before it becomes an audio form podcast. And you've been posting clips on your Instagram and Twitter, like 1 minute, maybe 90-second clips of each interview you do. And your interviews usually last, somewhere between an hour and 2 hours, say, but these are like 1 minute kind of highlights, and you do maybe 5 or 6 per episode. And I'm telling you, like, I just sort of every hour or hour and a half that I like start thumb through social media for a minute just for a break, your stuff always pops up and I always listen to it. And I love this kind of bite-sized social media drop of knowledge into my scroll.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the point. And I think I sort of landed on that once I started doing video as a way to lengthen the time frame that I'm able to promote an episode and kind of give my guests some spotlight, and to do so in a way that's hopefully useful to people. Like I've had a long and complicated relationship with social media, as my book attests to. And I'm sure people who have listened to my show for any number of episodes are sort of sick of hearing me talk about it. But I kind of have come to this sort of like an agreement with it, or with myself about it, where if I'm using social media to showcase the guests who appear on my show, that's useful to them, hopefully to the people who are watching it. And it's just a more dynamic way to do so than to just repeatedly post a link to the episode. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right.
This way people can get a taste. If they find the conversation or the bit of conversation that they see and hear compelling, then they can go in for the full thing.
Yeah, I think it's perfect. I think it does all the things that you just said, and I really enjoy engaging with the episodes on that level. And many times, in fact, I have kind of like been like, oh, I hadn't heard of this author, and I might not have listened to the episode because I just like it just missed me for whatever reason. But then I caught like 30 seconds of that, and I'm like, ooh, wait a second, like put that in like the TBL list. Like I'm gonna check out that author. So I love it. All right. One other preliminary before we get started is that you live in LA, and a lot of your book has like some great writing about LA. You say this great line: in LA, everybody's always telling everybody else how fucking busy they are. It's so exhausting. But there's like many great lines about LA. And I have had like a lot of LA authors on my show. So like just in the last few months, I had Tananarive Due, who teaches at UCLA, CJ Lead, who's a debut author, Carolyn Kepnes, who wrote the series You. Next week, I'm having on Ruth Madievsky, All Night Pharmacy.
She's gonna be on my show next week too.
Awesome.
Yeah.
But she seems like she's getting all the love. It's like a super buzz-tastic book. But my question to you is about like the LA literary scene, right? It's like definitely secondary. Like I don't need to live in LA to know that Hollywood is a bigger industry than the literary world in LA. But I'm just kind of curious, like, what is that like out there? What is the scene like? What do people say when they hear you're a writer? Like, are there more writers there now than there were, or what?
I don't know if I'm the best person to ask. I'm so busy with work and family that I don't get out as much as I probably should. And I'm not like in the mix at readings a lot. Right. I'm just working and reading, and that's kind of, I feel like, all that I do. But I will say that Los Angeles is it's a company town in a lot of ways. Hollywood is sort of the thing, but really when you parse it out, the number of people who work in Hollywood is really small relative to the total population of Los Angeles, and at the same time, I think it's a place that really is friendly to creative people. There's the music industry, there's movies, there's books to some extent. What else is here? Television. You know what I'm saying? Like the creative arts do play a central role in the identity of this place. And so when you tell people that you're a writer of any kind, nobody really bats an eye. And I think too that because the literary scene plays second or third fiddle or fourth fiddle to whatever else is happening creatively in town, that the people who are involved in books tend to be instantly friendly with one another. And there is a lot of camaraderie. And I know, I feel like I know a lot of the people who are mainstays. I don't see them as much as I wish I did, but I think that's the case for anybody, it seems, these days, who's living in a big city. You live in a big city, you know all these people, but you don't see them as much as you wish you did. But it's a good scene. And I think there are a lot of talented writers working out here. I mean, I'd be interested to try to sit down with a piece of paper and a pen and to figure out like a list, but there's a lot.
I mean, it's not, I mean, in Boston, Boston can get sort of snooty about its culture and its history and, feel like, I mean, in many ways, Massachusetts is sort of like a kind of intellectual and literary kind of forebear to like United States literary culture. And so like literature is like so big up here in a sense. And there isn't like another bigger like artistic industry, I would say. But I just am like, wait a minute, like every other writer this spring has been from LA. I'm like, what's going on?
Well, I think a lot of people might have fled the East Coast during the pandemic, or they've come out here because the weather's good, or they can find more space somehow with real estate because it's just a bigger land mass. I mean, there's all sorts of different reasons, but there are a lot. I've felt that there's a lot of this east to west immigration happening, maybe more so than west to east, which might be new. So I don't know what it is, but I think too, it's like, it's so damn hard to make $1 as a writer of books that people come out here to try to write for television thinking it's going to be lucrative, that's that whole thing.
Yeah. All right. So let's get into your book. Be brief and tell them everything. As I said, I love the title. Can we just like for a second talk about, are those your words? Is that like, or is that a quote from somebody? Or like, where is this amazing title coming from?
It comes from Charles Simic, the poet. Okay. Yeah. So I lifted that line. It's an epigraph for the book, and I read it in his work. I love reading poetry as a way to sort of grease the wheels before I do my own writing. And, I guess like when I'm working on a book length project, I will typically keep a file or even a sheet of paper, like in a desk drawer, where I just jot down ideas for titles. And that one ended up on the list, and it sort of stuck, that's the way that it works. But it's a great line, and it's kind of what I ultimately got to at the end of this long, arduous process, trying to write this book. That was the directive that I was giving myself, essentially.
And indeed, I mean, it falls into this category that I love, and I know you love too, the slim gem of a novel, the kind of, I think it's right around 200 pages long. And I think it's not just short, it is concise. I mean, like it's some books are short and just don't say anything, but everything about this book holds up that ethos, I think, of be brief and tell them everything. And, it feels like every sentence is earning its way in there. And I think like one of the things that I loved, I've heard you talk about this book in a number of different places. And one of the things that I loved about your process is it took, I think, 16 years to write this book, or at least it was 16 years between this and your first novel. And you said, like, when you finally kind of wrote this version, the final version of the novel, you sort of had been working with the material so long that it almost unconsciously fell into place. And it felt that way. It felt almost like it could have taken no other form.
Yeah. I mean, it's like there wasn't really an outline. And as I was working on what became the book, as I was like moving through the final draft, it was very intuitive. And what, I would end a chapter and what would come next, I would just sort of feel my way there. But it was because I was able to do that, I think, because I had spent so much time, and a lot of the material in the book had been worked over so many times that I had a real familiarity with it. And so I sort of knew where the puzzle pieces should fit. And it just took a long time for me to get to that point. And I think what ultimately ended up happening is that I surrendered to the material. I surrendered to writing about the most difficult stuff directly. And it was not until I did that the book started to work.
Well, Give me an example of something that you tried to write that you wrote like indirectly, but then ended up being direct? What was the indirect way?
Well, I mean, so I just writing away from the pain and the difficulty and the challenges associated with having a child with disabilities and the guilt and the anguish of it, So I tried to write entire novels that had nothing to do with this, or that were working at, on a sideways angle, that might have had some thematic similarities, but really had nothing to do with my direct experience. For this book and this story, I had to kind of just tell it directly. It is a novel just because I don't have a good memory, and I did not keep a diary of all this stuff. I don't know why. I mean, I cannot imagine keeping a diary of all this sort of stuff, but I ended up having to fictionalize to make the book work for a reader, but it's autofiction. I don't try to hide that. And, there may be subsequent books that I write where I diverge quite a bit and head off into opposite directions and invent all this stuff that serves as a proxy for how I'm actually feeling. There's different ways to do it. I don't think one is right or one is wrong, but for this particular project, I just sort of had to wrestle with it directly and surrender to what was really bothering me. But it's not easy to do and to make it palatable for a reader.
No, it's not. But nothing great is easy. And could we just like condense to like, I mean, this is so much of your book is about the messiness and the kind of indefinability of the artistic process and how complicated and stupid, frankly, it is. Just like how much like wasted time there is and dead ends and all of that. But for the sake of this discussion, can we just like romanticize into a kind of like 20-second soundbite the process of writing this book? And what I mean by that is like 16 years. Okay. So it was like 15 years of dead ends. And then one night you realized blank, and then you wrote the whole thing in 3 months. What is like that version of this, of the process?
God, I'm trying to think. A lot of it was written during the pandemic. And so I think that because everything, like life had slowed down so much, and social obligations and school obligations for my kids had sort of been foreclosed upon. That helped me because, I don't know if it was more like a decade. It's hard to really put a number on it because I was doing so many different other things, working, just hustling. It wasn't like I spent 16 years focused on this. It was, there's stops and starts. There were times I kind of wanted to walk away and quit. I mean, the whole thing, but you keep coming back if you're, if you have the writerly inclination, it's sort of impossible to quit, I think. Right. And so I think, trying to remember, I just had time to focus. I felt like I had sort of had it. I was like, this is it. I'm going to just try to do this. I'm just going to say the thing. And I was reading a lot of Philip Roth. I don't know why. You know what I'm saying? I think it was one of these, I have so many holes in my reading life that I'm embarrassed about. So I was trying to sort of like patch that one. But that was what I was reading. I read like, 7 or 8 of his novels during that time. And they were sort of the fuel. I don't know what it was, but that it helped me, and then it was a day-by-day thing. I was very disciplined. I think it was 5 months that I wrote the draft, and I wrote almost every day.
I think there's a lot of writers who watch this show, and I think just knowing from being in the writing world and having so many writer friends, there's a lot of writers out there who might be going through something, and I see already some comments about this in the comment section right now, but that might be going through a version of what you went through, which is I have the writer bug. I am a writer. I'm never going to stop writing. I have a ton of material, but I just don't know how to arrange it. I don't know what the story is. I don't know what the voice is. But if somehow the puzzle pieces could be rearranged, it would work. And it feels something like that's what happened here. It's like you knew this material inside and out. And I'm just wondering, and you've just been explaining like, it was COVID and you had time and you focused. But I guess a piece of what I'm wondering is, was it the switch to a kind of autofiction mode where you have a fictional character called Brad Listi? Was that a little bit of the new way in that created this?
Yeah. I mean, I just didn't pull punches. I mean, I was like, the narrator's named Brad Listi. and he has a child with disabilities, and he has a podcast called Otherppl, and he struggled for a long time to write this book, and he wrote these shitty versions of it that didn't work. And, I just said the thing, and I went directly into the most difficult stuff, and I just stayed with it. And that was the difference for me in this project. And it's not a conventionally plotted novel. Like, I don't think that anyone would characterize it that way. I think that I feel like it works. I felt like that when I was writing it, and I felt like that when I finished it. And I haven't heard too many people complain. In fact, I've gotten letters from people letting me know they liked the way that it was structured. And I have to say, so much of that was intuitive. I didn't have an architecture that I had drawn out on a piece of paper. I wasn't outlining. It was something that I just felt my way through. And the way that I conceive of the book in hindsight is that it's a meditation on creativity, like not just creativity as it pertains to art, but creativity as it pertains to the creation of family, like what it means to create on this planet under present circumstances, as chaotic and difficult and dismal as it can sometimes be.
I've heard you say about the book also that you hope that it gives some relief to other creatives, that they may see here is sort of the thing itself. Here is a person kind of in the most direct terms, grappling face to face with the void, really the void and the difficulty of being a creator. And is it fair to say that one of the main kind of hopes that you have for this project is that it reaches other creatives and gives them a kind of solace or a feeling of like, I'm not the only one?
Yeah. Or just like I go to books for that. I go to books for instruction. I go to books for a sense of communion and relief, and it can come in any form, so I always want to issue that caveat when I talk about this. Like, I get really frustrated, including frustrated with myself, when it comes to discussions around literature and what kind of literature is good literature, and is autofiction bad or good, and is it better to just write directly into the thing and not pull punches and just be autobiographical because that's what your novel is anyway, even if it's really built of all these inventions. It doesn't matter to me as a reader, really. It's just whether or not a book works for me. And it can be, I have a really wide range of kinds of books that I can read and enjoy and get stuff from. It ultimately just comes down to something sort of ineffable. It comes down to whether or not I feel like the writer has really done the work, and if the book is fully cooked, and I really do appreciate I appreciate when there is concision in a work of literature and a feeling that the author has really labored to be as efficient in the telling as possible. That doesn't mean that the book has to be 50,000 words and 200 pages long. It could be a 500-page novel or a 1,000-page novel. It's just that there's not wasted motion in it. So, I think that's kind of where I've come to.
If I had the time to create clips of my interviews, that would be the very first clip I released from this interview. That was so beautifully said. It captures so much of what I kind of deeply hold to be true about the creative process. There was so much in there about fully cooked, like feeling whether something is fully cooked, feeling just definitely whether the author has command of their material. An author that I thought of a lot when I was reading this book is Samuel Beckett. And I think, I am loose. I used to love Samuel Beckett. I mean, I still love him, but I used to know more about I used to have more of a command of his biographical details. But if memory serves, he was just absolutely a gifted, incredibly gifted literary thinker right out the gate. And he was a kind of an assistant to James Joyce. And he was casting about for years and years. And it was only maybe in his 40s, but sort of midway through life, that he had a kind of nervous breakdown, and he had a kind of also a creative breakthrough, which gave us Waiting for Godot. And I think at that point, you feel with Waiting for Godot, I mean, that work, I think, just still works, still one of my favorite pieces of literature, mainly because of, I think, the friendship that's at the middle of it. But another quality of that work that I think actually falls off in later Samuel Beckett is the concision of it. And you just feel like this guy, you can feel that he had been suffering to find a way into what he wanted to talk about for so long. And finally, he just opened the right door after trying 1,000 different doors. And there it was. And that thing just sort of cannot be compacted any shorter than it is. And anyway, there was a lot of kind of the way that Beckett talks about his own kind of despair, his own trying to make meaning, wrestle meaning out of a world that is so chaotic, just in his way of just saying directly, I am suffering, like, I don't know how I'll go on, is like a book, is like a line that could have been in your book. I mean, it was just in that same tackling the difficult emotions head on. And I don't, does that ring true for you at all as for
Sure.
Beckett as a comp?
I mean, yeah. I mean, what rings true is just the concerns, like the thematic concerns, the spiritual concerns, if that's a way to put it.
Yeah.
Trying to deal with the problem of human suffering in the mind and life circumstances that can be tragic and difficult, that come at you seemingly out of the blue. Everybody, if you live long enough, will go through something like this. And my book is about, at least in part, trying to respond. And I love that kind of literature. I'm hungry, like I said, for instruction and solace, and for somebody who is doing that hard work on my behalf.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that concision, because when you're saying really complex things in a simple way, I think you're doing the reader a great service. And it's hard to do. It's much easier to say complex things in complex ways. And I'm always eager to find writers who can help simplify things for me or bring like new clarity, especially maybe in times where I'm having a hard time. I think we turn to books like this in particular and are hungry for books like this in particular when we're struggling and suffering. And I mean, I think most people are struggling and suffering fairly often.
I agree. And I wanted to talk a little bit about autofiction and sort of what that aesthetic does. Like what let me start over. What you just said sort of made me think about, it kind of sort of triggered for me some thoughts that I was having during reading your book, which is like, who is the kind of person who is like the right, so to speak, kind of person to come to this book? Or like what stage in your life would you be in? What kind of emotional makeup would you have to be hungry for just this kind of book? Set aside the fact that like anybody can read your book and enjoy it, but like who in particular would come to a book like this and want a book written in just this way? And there was something you said in a different interview where you said that you have trouble sometimes with fiction, and because you want the writer to just come out and say what they mean. Just like, don't dress up your emotional autobiography in these fancy words, in these made up characters. Like, I see through it. This is just a game you're playing that I don't have time for. This is not what you said, but this is just me kind of expanding upon it. But, Sheila Heti, Knausgard, Rachel Cusk, these are some authors that sort of have written about their sort of exhaustion with like the trappings of, artifice in fiction. And I was thinking about that, and I was just thinking like, but sometimes artifice can be insightful. It can be entertaining. I mean, Tolstoy wrote a very long essay about Shakespeare and about how much he doesn't like Shakespeare. And that's a whole separate topic. But one of the things that he kept saying about Shakespeare is like, I just don't understand why his characters just can't come right out and say it. Like sort of the way Tolstoy thought he would come right out and say it. And anyway, I'm just wondering, like, so what do you think about this question of artifice? Are you, do you get exhausted in the way some of these other writers I mentioned are exhausted with artifice? Do you feel like maybe there's a certain kind of reader or a certain time in a person's life where they just get tired of artifice, and maybe they'd want it at a different time, but when they're really looking for answers, they want something that is totally stripped down?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I kind of all of the above. And then I would add that I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. And I can have that, like I've had that very string of thoughts before. And I can be reading a novel that is like artifice or is like, it's fiction. It's straight invention. And I can feel the author's life problems embedded within it. And I'm like, oh, please just drop the mask and just talk to me. I've had that feeling.
Drop the mask and talk to me. What a great line.
And I've also read books that are very much artifice and invention that are brilliantly done and that feel maybe it feels like the best way in for this particular author to these particular personal matters. So there are no rules. There are no rules either way. So when people say, fuck autofiction, I hate autofiction, that bothers me. When people say autofiction is the thing and people need to drop the artifice and I'm exhausted by their silly artifice, that is bullshit too. There's no rules. It's just whether or not the person is able to execute on the page in a manner that resonates with me personally as a reader. And if it doesn't resonate with me personally as a reader, it's very likely that it will resonate with other people. That's sort of the beauty of it. That's kind of where I land.
Yeah, and you said something like that earlier too, just about how like the only question ultimately is, does it work for me? And I think there's sort of like a 3-stage process that, writers sometimes go through where like the novice shows up and says, oh, like there are no rules. I'm just going to do it my way. And then you go through the next phase, which is like, oh my God, there's so many rules. I need to learn my craft and I need to master these rules. And then there's the final stage, which is, yeah, there's really no rules. And it's
right. Right. That's true. Yeah. And I mean, I think that people just have to do, as a reader, I think I'm a really friendly reader. I am always cheering for a book, always, because I know how hard it is to write one. Even a book that if I feel, for example, is sort of half cooked, or I feel like, wow, this is just a person who would have been better served to just address these matters directly rather than creating like a unicorn and whatever it is that people kind of create in their fictions to dress it up. Even that person, I will read their book like rooting for it, because I know how hard that is. It's like anybody who finishes a book length project, I'm inclined to cheer for. So I'm an easy audience, I think, ultimately.
I love that. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons why you and I both have podcasts, because I feel precisely that way. I mean, I feel everybody who comes on my show, like some people say to me, like, do you like every book that you read, like for your show, right? And I'm just like, well, I like some more than others. But I'm just like, look, my job is not to be a critic. I have zero interest in being a critic. What I have interest in is supporting other authors, because I am just like about 95% of how I feel about any book is like anybody who got a book published has been through a kind of war. And I am here to say to those people, you did it. And like, let's just kind of celebrate that for a moment.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm the same way. I'm not a critic. I have my feelings, but they're sort of beside the point. I think that the podcast and the conversations that I've done over the years really were a response to frustration that I felt and continue to feel over how many great, like truly great artists there are out there who are doing this work who the broader culture know nothing of. That maddens me still. And that is what drives me. And then I also think, if I'm being totally candid, that it's good for me to be social in this way. I think, I'm pretty introverted. I can be extroverted, but I'm pretty introverted. And so it's good for me to have conversations with other adults, that are meaningful. And to be honest, in the world that we live in, where you're socializing, I'm a parent, so I'm socializing with other parents. Everybody's got a phone. It's chaotic. It's never really that interesting or meaningful. And that's not a knock on the people I'm socializing with. It's just context, really.
Yeah.
It's hard to have like an actual conversation when there are screaming children everywhere or when people are constantly diving into their phones. So I think that the enforced ritual of an hour-long or 2-hour-long conversation in the absence of like technology intrusions is super meaningful and vital to me. And then the last thing I will say is that I like to be of service. I like to have that component in my life. I think I've had a lot of breaks that a lot of writers haven't had. There are writers who, really have had to scrap and fight. Not that I haven't scrapped and fought, but I just, I didn't have student loan debt. That's not nothing. And I've always thought of that. And I've, talking to writers and buddies of mine here in LA, people who are struggling with that, I feel an obligation to be of service to this tribe and to try to pay it forward a little bit. So that's been a component of it.
Preach, brother. I feel just the same way. I feel like so great about giving something to other authors and giving them a platform. So I am right with you on that. I did want to ask you a few more questions about the podcast, but before we get to that, I had one other writing question that I wanted to talk to you about, which is that you say so many wonderful things about creativity. So this is really just picking one that I particularly resonated with. But you say, like, with this book, you were trying to write a book as if you were already dead, or as if you only had 6 months to live. You say it kind of in a few different ways, and maybe you've said it outside the book as well. But just there's this idea of, like, as if this will be the last thing you ever write, or if your wisdom could be distilled and almost like carved in stone, like what would be so worth writing that you would make a stone carver chisel it out and write the whole thing? And I just felt that sense of distillation and condensation in the work. But I think I just love it as a philosophy. And as I was thinking about it, I'm like, geez, almost like what is the kind of book that you would write that wouldn't follow that advice? Like, it just seems like any book that didn't follow that advice, this might be the last book you ever read. Leave it all on the table. Any book that didn't follow that seems sort of inherently frivolous to me. But I just wanted you to kind of unpack that piece of advice.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good advice. I mean, there's all sorts of good advice, and there's all sorts of reasons for writing a book. But I will say that as a reader, I can sometimes find myself reading a book by a very gifted author who's prolific and publishes a lot of books and has published like books that I've loved. And then I will come to one or two that I feel like don't have as much vital energy inside of them. And I will wonder if the writer, like, just had a 2-book deal and needed to publish another book. The writer needed money. I mean, there are different reasons to write a book, right? But as a reader, the kinds of books that I most love to read are books that have that vitality to them and that feel like somebody's like shouting across the void. I mean, that is when things are on the line and this person has suffered and is struggling and is just has something to say. And I think personally, that is a guiding principle for me. And if that means I write fewer books, that's okay with me. Like, I'd rather write books that I really, and I don't know if I can write a book otherwise. That's another thing. I can't just write a novel to entertain myself. I might try it. I really want to see if I could. It sounds lovely. But for me, it's like this, it's like, it cuts deeper than that. And it's born of maybe more suffering than that. It's like it's a less sexy process. But when a book is written in that vein and for those reasons, and it's done well, I think that it can, at its best, be a sort of life raft for the reader. It can be medicinal, such a relief, especially if you meet that person when they're in a similar frame of mind or in a similar set of circumstances.
Yeah. And I just felt that so much through this book, that you were like desperate for me to understand what you meant. You're like, please, like, not that you're saying please, but it's just like, it was clear you had worked on it so much and distilled it so much. It's just like, please, I need to communicate this to you. I need you to understand this. And I just feeling that like, it's not frivolous. This person isn't just filling up my airtime. This person is profoundly respectful of the fact that I'm giving my 3-4 hours for a book of this size to read this. And just, I like the unspoken contract from the tone of the sentences is, hey buddy, I'm not going to fucking waste your time. Just give me a second. Let me tell you this. It'll be worth it. I mean, like, I felt that.
I needed to tell myself as well, but I think like for a book that's dealing with as much heaviness as this book is, short made sense. And, I don't think anybody wants to read it. I mean, maybe they want to read a 600-page novel of me droning about, the worst stuff that's ever happened to me. Or
well, there's Knausgard for that. No, no shade.
no shade. There's no rules. There's different ways to do it. For me, I really wanted to be efficient. This length of a book was explicit. Like, for me, it was not something that I just sort of landed on. I wanted to write a short book that had like no wasted emotion in it, but that also felt heavy. You know what I'm saying? Like, it felt substantive. It wasn't just like a trifle. And, whatever feeling you got off the page reading it, in the way that you just described, I felt like I was sort of saying the same thing to myself. Like, I just gotta, and it was also like, this was my last swing at this book. If I could not get this book written and published this time, I was truly going to abandon it, or that was part of the plan. So thank God it worked out.
It did. It certainly did. Look, we've got a few questions from the audience, but I had a few questions about podcasting. Time has just flown. So I just want to ask you a few questions about it. Obviously, it's a great show. Obviously, it's so successful. Writers love that show. You are kind of a cherished literary citizen. And I just wanted to ask you a few questions about how you go about your work. So one is the style of the show. So I'm a journalist. I was trained as a journalist, came up as a journalist, and my style on the show, I always do have an agenda. I mean, like, whether it appears free flowing in this conversation or not, there was a lot of preparation, and part of the preparation, not that you don't prepare, but I mean, part of my preparation anyway, is sort of like, I got to get through certain topics, and there's going to be kind of an arc almost to the show. It's like, it's a performance. It's like a dance that we're doing. And I think, I've heard you talk about your show, and obviously I've listened to your show, and there is this, there's kind of a peer-to-peer style of podcasting, which is like some of the most popular podcasts in the world follow this. I mean, Mark Maron does this, Joe Rogan does this. I think you do this, it seems anyway, more than me, which is just like, I think you've described it as like, at least in the beginning when you were starting the show, you're like, well, I'm just going to turn on the mic, hit record, and like, let's see where the conversation goes. There is a kind of like, you're not leading the dance so much, it seems, as like you are like a peer with the person, and you're talking about your life, they're talking about their life. I just kind of wanted to hear about your like philosophy of how you approach executing an interview.
Yeah, it's changed over the years. When I first started, it was very loose, very informal, very experimental. I thought it was going to be a month, 2 months, and then I was going to be done. That was literally the conceit. I did not put much thought into it. I think it was a different time in podcasting history. There were far fewer podcasts. Broadly speaking, definitely there were far fewer literary podcasts. And I find a lot of literary conversation to be, or at least back then, the idea was like, it's not entertaining enough, and it's hard to talk about a book that 98% of the audience has not read and make it interesting. Who wants to listen to two people talk about a book that they haven't read? So I was interested, I think, in the beginning at just talking to people and finding out who they were. This was also an outgrowth of my frustration with social media, where everybody is kind of curating themselves. And I was like, who are you? Let's actually talk and see what happens. And so the show was very informal. It was not book centered in the way that it is now. It sort of evolved. And I'm not sure if I think it's a little bit of a hybrid. I want to preserve some of the spirit of the original show, which was loose and maybe a little goofy. I don't listen to the old episodes. I have no idea. Sometimes I will go back for my flashback episodes, and I'm like shouting into the microphone, or I don't know, like you can hear it, so hopefully it gotten a little bit better. But I will also say, the way that I sort of make sense of it is that the fully improvised, loose, personal conversations, to do it that way is like basically to kind of like base jump, with your guest. There's just nothing. You're just like, okay, let's talk. Who are you? That was kind of how it is, or how it was back in those days. And when it went well, it went really well. And it often did. When the person just met me in conversation and we hit it off a little bit, there was some kind of chemistry. The highs could be really high, but the lows could be low, because when you didn't have a rapport with the guest, or when the person wasn't really up for that, when they were like, wait a minute, why aren't you treating me like Michael Silverblatt? Like, why aren't we talking about my prose? That could be destabilizing. And I think maybe sometimes the conversation wouldn't be as, engaging or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But, I think just over the years, I've sort of shifted maybe to make it interesting for myself. Maybe I'll shift back at some point. I don't know. But I want to say for people listening, and not just to my show, but to your show, to anybody who's doing author interview content, literary media, the amount of preparation that it takes to do a show like this one, like mine, like any of the literary interview shows, is so time intensive and labor intensive, because to read 2 and 3 books a week, to meet somebody in conversation to discuss this thing that they've spent years of their life creating and meditating on and suffering over, it's a heavy responsibility that I feel in some ways. And it's a responsibility that I gladly take on. It's very enriching to me, but it is just particular to literary media, the amount of time that it requires to really do the prep.
Right.
And so that's where the show is now. And hopefully it still feels conversational, because I want people who are not, I want writers to listen to it, but I would love for a more general audience to listen to it, so that I can bring them into the fold and get them to read more. That's right. The project here. It's not just to create kind of a circular firing squad. It's not just to create just I want there to be a sense of tribal community where writers feel like this is a place for writers to come and commiserate and learn about one another and find out about great new books. But I'm also wanting for literary culture to move just a little bit more towards the center of the cultural conversation in this country and around the world, because, like I said earlier, there are so many unbelievably gifted artists doing this work who sell 500, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, whatever it is, copies. And it feels criminal to me that they are not more widely known and that their work is not more widely celebrated.
I've heard you say before that one of the main reasons you do the podcast is to foster a book community. And that's just sort of what you were talking about a moment ago. And I just, as a final question from me, before we get to some audience questions, just wanted to ask you, why is that important? Why, if you could have your dream come true and this book community, however you want to define it, was more prominent, why would that be good beyond kind of shedding light on these authors? What is a book community?
Well, I think it's first of all, I think it's for writers, we're in a situation where everybody's kind of isolated. We're all siloed off behind our laptops, working on our books and, trying to get famous on social media or whatever we do. And we don't often have time to actually connect and to have a 3-dimensional conversation, that gets into the weeds a little bit. And so by having these conversations with writers and then sharing them with listeners and with writers, it sort of gives people a way in. It gives people hopefully a sense of solace. To listen to a good conversation is really medicinal for me in a way that's not entirely dissimilar to reading a book, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, because it offers entree into a person's consciousness, their interior. When you're listening to people really get into it with one another, it's very stimulating in a way that's kind of literary or similar to the way that literature works on me. And so, I think I like creating community for that reason. I think, I clearly need this, in my own just personal life. I need to have these conversations or I wouldn't keep doing it. It brings me so much. And I think that, when it comes to just getting the word out about work, when it comes to I don't know. I think I have a lot of sympathy for people who spend years and years on a book and then it comes to publication time and they're like, well, shit, now what do I do? So that's really it.
And I'm I just love those people. When you described that person just moments ago about this person who spent all these years and their book is finally out, and just thinking of that person just makes me feel like, oh, I can help you.
Yeah, right. Especially if you've been there in any form. Or if you just, you spent time on any kind of endeavor for years and years, and then you get to the point where you want to try to let the world know about it. But I think it's important, and I think it's important to go beyond maybe the community that we feel and develop on social media, which is just problematic for me. I think conversation is messy in a way that I love. And I think when two people are talking in good faith, especially when there is like a connection and some real rapport, it's just lovely to listen to. I was a listener of interviews for years before I ever started doing a show. It was one of my preferred like media. It was to listen to like Fresh Air or listen to anybody. I could listen to Howard Stern. I could listen to Fresh Air. I could listen to Charlie Rose back before it was revealed that he, is deeply problematic. Like that show was lovely to me just because it was like adults talking. Old episodes of Dick Cavett, like just that sort of thing has always been something that I really gravitate to.
I love me some Dick Cavett.
Yeah.
Right.
I know. That's like my dream would be to be like create like the new Dick Cavett show. That would be my, yeah.
We have the same dream. No. All right. Let's take a few questions from the audience while we have time. So audience question, you revealed a lot of yourself in this book. Is there anything big you left out?
I sure hope not. I can't imagine there's lots of stuff about me that is not revealed in this book. But I do feel like the big stuff about my life is all in there. And I think there is a quote, I want to say it's from Annie Dillard. I don't know it off the top of my head, but the gist of it is that you should, when you're writing a book, like don't save anything. Spend it all. There will be more. Like the well will replenish, or life will dole out, even more stuff for you to suffer over and write about. But I think that was my attitude with this book, was to just spend it all, say it all, like don't leave anything out.
You know what I've also found? I'm curious what you think about this as a fellow writer. I've found that I sometimes have like an interesting thought or an interesting image that appears to me, like in the process of writing a book, and the thought or the topic or the sentence seems like, oh, well, I know just what project that's for, like for a future project. I'm going to put it in some other file. But on that note of like, throw everything into the project, I have a theory that the reason why that seemingly off-topic phrase or subject or image appeared to me is actually that it's on topic and I just don't understand why. And so it's sort of like, if you have whatever, like I just feel like any creative project take like 2 years for somebody to write a book. I just feel like even if the book purports to be about, XYZ or purports to be in this genre, it's actually just about, here's what this person was thinking about for those couple years,
Yeah. I mean, it's I think that you'll have moments of surprise, and it can be delightful when you're working on a book, especially when you have spent as much time on it as I spent on mine, where you're pouring through old material, you're looking through, old files on your computer, and you'll find resonances with the draft that you're working on, or you'll find like things that might on the surface seem disparate from what your central concerns are, but that are actually related in interesting ways. And to build those things into a project is a lot of fun creatively, and it's also fun for a reader. I love that when there are like unexpected associations, or a narrative will make like a sudden turn, in a way that feels at first blush like it's going off in a crazy direction, but then it comes back and sort of circles back to the main thread. So that stuff is part of the magic of the creative process. I've talked over the years with so many writers on my show who go through this situation creatively where there are these weird synchronicities between, say, book research and what the novelist was working on narratively. You'll be writing a book about, the financial world, and you'll be researching hedge fund guys, or you'll be researching the crash in 1929 or whatever it is. And then suddenly you'll be reading about this person who, as it turns out, was like second cousins with a person who you're not, your narrator was just talking to in the section of the book that you're writing. You know what I'm saying? Like this sort of stuff is the magic of the creative process. And I love it when those sorts of things happen.
Completely. Let's rush through. I have to say rush because we only got a few minutes left.
I have time if you want to push. I mean, we can go a few minutes over.
Well, on A Mighty Blaze, there's another show that comes on at the top of the hour, so we have to wrap by 3. So
lightning round.
Lightning round. We have a question from Ryan in the audience. I've been listening to you for like 10 years. How is grappling with aging changing your professional writing and family life and perspectives?
That's a good question. I mean, I try to take care of myself so that I feel like I have to, as a father. I've got to try to do my best to give myself decent odds of aging well and being able to be productive, like well into my old age. I would love to be able to still be active and vital into my 80s and 90s or whatever. I'd love to be one of those people. I think most of us would. I think that maybe as a writer, it has given me more of this sense of only wanting to work on projects where I feel like I really have something to say. Maybe it's helped me prioritize or something, or given me that kind of perspective where I don't really come to it thinking about fame and fortune in the way that I might have when I was like 24. I think maybe that's what's changed. It's really about the rewards of the work itself and wanting to say the stuff that is most vitally important to me and that I'm struggling with the most, because I think ultimately my books are for my kids, maybe their kids one day, like that's really who it's for at the end of it all. So I better say what I really want to say.
God, I love that. And I feel like the same way about, my book. I was recently writing the acknowledgments to my book, which comes out in March. And I sort of have a bit in there to my kids. And it's just part of the spirit of what I said was like, one day you might wonder, like, what was your dad all about? And it's like, here, now, and I just feel like there's another thing about that, which is similar to what you said about, write it like there's no tomorrow, write it like as if you were already dead. There's a way that I feel like there's an imperative that comes when you imagine your children as the audience. It's like, I wouldn't lie to my kid. It's sort of like, not that I'm like a big liar, but I would definitely never mislead my children. And so kind of thinking about them is a way that keeps me creatively on track.
Yeah. Yeah. You feel like a sense of responsibility, and, maybe a sense too, it helps pull me back from being too cynical on the page, like that can be something that I could veer towards or want to indulge in, like getting really dark and macabre about it. So how do you walk the line, between seeing things in a clear-eyed way, even if they're difficult and dark things, but then writing about it in a way that maybe honors that but doesn't wallow in it.
Right.
I think maybe in the absence of children, I might wallow in it more, and that has its merits sometimes. I mean, it can be funny to wallow sometimes, but it can also, I think it can maybe demoralize the reader too, and I don't want to do that, especially if the reader is my kid.
Right. All right, folks, the book is Be Brief and Tell Them Everything by Brad Listi. His podcast, of course, is Otherppl. We've put a bunch of links in the chat to buy the book. Please also subscribe to Brad's podcast. If you like The Thoughtful Bro, boy, you are going to love Otherppl. Brad, thank you for coming on the show. But before we leave, I just have one final question I wanted to ask you, which is that you've done 850 episodes now. You've talked to so many writers, so many of the greatest writers that on the planet Earth right now have been on your show. After all that time and all those episodes, can you just tell us something that you know about writing now that you didn't when you started the show, and something that kind of specifically has come from talking to other writers rather than something you might have just learned along the way separately?
It's hard to answer because I feel like so many of the things that you learn about writing are elemental. And for me, it's just that I'm hard-headed or something. I've had to relearn. People ask me, what have you learned from the show? Mm-hmm. Like that question comes up a lot, having talked to all these writers. Right. And the way that I boil it down is that you have to write on a regular schedule, pretty much. Some people write every day. Some people write in bursts. Some people write 3 days a week. But most people who do this work and do it well and create lots of books over the course of a lifetime write with discipline. That's what I've learned. You have to read a lot. Mm-hmm. Input equals output. If you're not reading a lot and deeply and enjoying it and getting something from it, you're probably not going to write anything that's worth a shit. So you have to read in a disciplined way and approach that part of it as work as well. The best writers, the most prolific writers on my show are incredibly well read, typically. occasionally maybe there's somebody who's just like some sort of odd genius who reads kind of, but most people are deep readers and regular readers, and it's been something that they've done over the course of a lifetime. So it's write a lot on a regular schedule, read a lot, and I'll be damned, there's a third thing that I've learned, and I'm spacing it. Have I said it before? I don't know if it's in your notes, but write a lot, read a lot, don't quit. I mean, but it's really those two things. I mean, you know, like that's it. And it's disappointing maybe, you know, it's not like a sexy answer, but there's nothing, I mean, that's just the way that it is. If you want to get this work done and you want to be a published writer who sends books out into the world, in the absence of those two things, it's not going to happen. We all sort of know it, but if you're anything like me, you have to relearn it repeatedly. And, you know, hopefully at this point, 850 some odd episodes in, it's finally sunk in.
Is there any end in sight, by the way? Do you have a goal of like 1,000 episodes, I'll call it quit? Or it sounds like, actually, from talking to you in this interview, it's so necessary to kind of your approach to life and your joy in life that you would never give up.
You know, I think getting close to 1,000, it's like, well, I got to at least get there. This has happened repeatedly, though. I've been like, well, I'm almost to 500, you know, like, and then these big round numbers sort of like lurk there, and you feel like, well, I can't, you know, I don't know, to be honest with you. It's about some practical considerations financially and being able to keep doing this. It's not easy. And what I will say to people listening, and not just people listening who might be listeners of my show, for any show that you listen to, especially in literary media, support the show if there's a way to do so, because it's hard to do this work. It takes a lot of work. I love to do it, but you know, it would be, let me put it to you this way. If the show does end, it will likely end because I run out of money. It will not be because I want to stop. It will be because it's not financially viable to support a family and keep doing it, you know? So I just think it's important for people, you know, buy your friends' books, buy the books of authors who you want to see keep writing, you know, like join the Patreon of the podcasts you want to see keep going. If you're consuming someone's content, pay for it. That's what I would say. And, you know, it's hard though, because these things are up on every podcast platform and they're free, and people are just, I think, accustomed to getting audio for free, but it's not free to create. It takes a lot of work to create it, and it's a labor of love. But so that's a long-winded answer. It's sort of like something I often want to say, but I don't want to, you know, I don't want to be a blowhard about it. And I hope at the minimum I get to 1,000. I've often said I would love to keep podcasting until I'm 90, which would put me at 3,000 episodes. So we'll see. We'll see.
All right. Well, I hope so, Brad. It's been so great to talk to you. I just love that we did this. Thank you for making time for this show. Thank you for making time for your show. It is truly a pleasure. And I just want to also say thank you. Like, not just thank you for being here today, but just like, thank you for who you are in the literary community. I mean, I think this dream you have of fostering a book culture and a literary culture, I mean, your show is doing that. And us folks out here in the trenches, writers, we look to you and we think, hey man, Brad's leading the way here. So thank you, sort of, from all of us who are fans of your show.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I've loved meeting you and talking with you. I appreciate the opportunity to appear on The Thoughtful Bro with you.
All right, folks. I'll be back next week with Ruth Matievsky. She's also appearing on Brad's show. You could listen to or talk to both of us next week. And we'll see you next Tuesday at 2. Brad, thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you so much.